Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy's webinar, Early Recovery Fund, Lessons Learned. I'm Nancy Beers, and I'm the Program Manager for CDP's Midwest Early Recovery Fund. We are excited that you have joined us today to learn more about our Early Recovery Fund's unique and innovative approach to post-disaster grant making. The fund's very first grant was awarded 16 months ago for recovery work in Pilger, a small rural community of 350 people in northeast Nebraska, devastated by an EF4 tornado. Since then, we have awarded a total of 23 grants totaling nearly $1.2 million to multiple local organizations in communities impacted by low-attention disasters in our 10-state region. But the Early Recovery Fund is more than just an efficient and effective grant-making process. It is a fully developed, pre-disaster funded program with a distinctive work plan, guiding principles, measurable outcomes, and a responsive, web-based data collection system. So far, our work has taken us to 5 states in our 10-state region: South Dakota, Missouri, Nebraska, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. We've responded to flash floods, tornadoes, severe storms, straight-line winds, and riverine flooding. In our work, we have partnered with national organizations, state and local nonprofits, state FOAD, FEMA, tribal governments, county foundations, and local grassroots community leaders to help build the local capacity to ensure those most vulnerable to the effects of disasters have the resources they need to recover. Today, we are honored to highlight and share some of that important, challenging work. We are excited today to have with us an expert group of panelists. Elizabeth Disco-Shearer is the Chief Operating Officer of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul's Disaster Services Division in Washington, D.C., and has over 25 years of experience in leadership, governance, and regulatory compliance. Currently, she serves on the Society of St. Vincent de Paul's National Disaster Committee, the National VOAD Drought Task Force, and is the former chair of the National VOAD Disaster Case Management Committee. In her current role, she coordinates disaster recovery across the United States for St. Vincent de Paul and is managing recovery projects in 31 states. We also have today with us Linda Johnston, and she's the Tulsa County Director of Social Services. She provides administrative oversight for an indigenous health care clinic, an at-cost pharmacy, a burial assistance program, a food assistance program, and an emergency shelter for homeless families. She has served as the Vice President of Tulsa Area United Way Board of Trustees, Community Investment Chair for Tulsa Area United Way, and Chair of the Long-Term Care Authority. Additionally, Linda successfully chaired Tulsa's County United Way campaign for a number of years. Linda previously worked for the Texas Department of Human Services, where she served the needs of the less fortunate in multiple capacities, such as caseworker, quality assurance manager, senior program manager, and as a regional trainer. We're also joined today by Deb Hendricks, who is the statewide volunteer coordinator for the Missouri State Emergency Management Agency. Prior to coming to SEMA, she had a 28-year career with the state of Missouri, primarily as a public information professional. The majority of that time was spent at the Department of Social Services, where she served as Director of Communications for 11 years. The last 8 years of her tenure with DSS were in the Department's Children's Division, where one of her duties was the Division Emergency Management Officer. In that position, she worked with the team to create the division's emergency management plan and also served as chair of Missouri's Access and Functional Needs Committee and Children and Youth in Disasters Committee. And finally, Lisa Adler, who is the Northwest Regional Director for Lutheran Social Service of South Dakota. Lisa has more than 18 years of disaster-related experience in volunteer coordination, case management, mental health crisis intervention, long-term recovery, community resilience, and emotional spiritual care. As the LSS of South Dakota Lutheran Disaster Response State Coordinator, she has increased the visibility of the agency's response and has developed the policy and procedures for the core components of disaster response noted previously. Lisa has also been an active member of South Dakota volunteer organizations active in disaster. We use the acronym VOAD. And since 2000, she's been there since 2003 and now serves as the president of South Dakota VOAD and has done that since 2010. Over the next 30 minutes or so, our panelists will engage in a discussion about the current status of their work with the Midwest Early Recovery Fund, the impact of that work on their organizations and the communities they are serving, and how funders, NGOs, and community leaders can participate in this work or similar work in their region, state, or community. Before we get started, a few bits of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. You may submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to all of your questions at the end of the webinar. And now I'd like to turn to Joe Ruiz for some opening remarks. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Nancy. First, let me say thank you. UPS is very proud to support and sponsor the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and the Insight series. CDP does a tremendous job of bringing together such an esteemed panel like today to talk about and discuss important topics around the disaster cycle and the focusing on long-term recovery. I also want to highlight the CDP's efforts for your work with creating the disaster playbook and the state of disaster philanthropy, tremendous tools that can support many funders and others who want to engage in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. And as the director of the UPS Foundation's Humanitarian Relief and Resilience Program, we are committed to providing support across the disaster cycle. This year, we're committed over $14 million in funding, technical support, and skilled and in-kind support across the globe with strategic partners like CDP, who bring tremendous insight into how we can make this long-term recovery more prominent and get more funders to focus on it. As a private sector organization, my advice to any of the other private sector organizations, which we understand there's tremendous pressure at any time there's a disaster, but one best practice or lesson learned that we have is that you can commit a certain amount of money at the outset and make a portion of that committed to long-term recovery, where you don't have to announce right up front. So for any other private sector organizations on the phone, that's one way that you can appease your CEO suite and still be out front with your commitments, but also hold some of that commitment for long-term recovery for specific organizations like CDP and the Midwest Recovery Fund. With that, again, very excited to hear what our esteemed panel has to say. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Joe. In mid-October of 2014, I was hired by CDP to help create a very unique and groundbreaking program, the Midwest Early Recovery Fund. Groundbreaking? Yes, because it is a fund developed before disasters occur, with the undeniable certainty that disasters will occur, and that the communities impacted by those disasters will need valuable, often hard to locate resources to recover. Unique? Yes, because it specifically targets low-attention disasters in the Midwest, a region of our country that has 20% of the land mass with only 10% of the population, made up of hundreds of small and/or rural communities that do not garner much public attention when affected by a disaster. And without news coverage, recovery resources are most often scarce. So far, we have given 23 grants to support 17 organizations, responding in 13 communities in 5 states. To date, the average size of a grant from the fund is about $46,900. Our largest grant was $127,000, and our smallest has been $3,500. Approximately 75% of our grants have been made for community support services, Approximately 15% of our grants have been made to provide support for training, outreach, and education services. And the remaining 10% of our grants have been allocated to nonprofits supporting the unique needs of children post-disaster. Our early recovery fund investments have provided much needed hope and invaluable resources to hundreds of disaster survivors across the Midwest. Our grants have helped build the capacity of local organizations and empowered them to serve their neighbors at a time of great need and suffering. We have intentionally sought out disaster-impacted communities that few others have noticed, let alone invested their time, effort, energy, or financial resources in. These amazing communities like Sand Springs, Oklahoma, Delmont, South Dakota, and Crow Creek Reservation are more resilient today because of the education, training, process development, and tools the fund has provided them. Today, we wanted you to hear from some of our grantees about the incredible work they are doing every day on the ground in small communities across the Midwest. I know Lisa was having some trouble joining our webinar. Lisa, are you on? She is not. I'm going to just briefly, I don't know if Lisa will be able to join us. I know she's on Pine Ridge Reservation today holding a long-term recovery meeting. Lisa is also the South Dakota VOAD chair, and I was hoping she could share a little bit for our listeners about what a VOAD does. Every state has a VOAD. They are made up of, is that Lisa?
It is. I am so sorry I'm late. I was having technical difficulties.
That's okay. That's okay. There you are. That's what's important. Hey, Lisa, glad you joined us. So we were talking about you a minute ago, and I said you're also the South Dakota VOAD chair, and I know you provide amazing leadership in that role. Can you tell our listeners today that might not know much about a state VOAD, how that organization works and its value to local communities impacted by disasters?
Sure. You know, our VOAD is made up of 15 different organizations that do disaster service work across the state. And the primary goal of our VOAD is to really coordinate, provide cooperation, coordinate services, provide collaboration of identifying what common goals we might have for a disaster that's occurred, and then just to provide really good communication. So an example would be when we had a disaster in Delmont, one of the first things we did is we had the VOAD go in, and several of the partners came in and started working with the town to develop long-term recovery and to work with them on developing that. But at the same time, Red Cross was in doing their assessments and providing the other VOAD partners information from their assessments so that we didn't have to duplicate that process. So VOAD's mission is really to provide that format or a forum for us to get together and share information, make sure that we're not duplicating services, and then making sure that we're identifying all those unmet needs that might be out there, and to work closely with each other to provide the services for those unmet needs. And sometimes that's working with our state VOAD members, but it oftentimes means reaching out to our national VOAD members too and pulling them into the fold.
Right, so you're really the conduit for all those services for a community, right? You're like that coordinating agency.
Right. What we try to do is just make sure all that coordination that needs to occur so that the needs of the community get addressed. And not only those initial response and recovery needs, but then also community resiliency, looking forward at that, and how do we really focus on making sure the work that we do builds a base to help the community be resilient after the disaster as well.
Yeah, I know you do that work. You do it really great. I've seen it in person. You and I have spent a lot of time together over the past several months. We've been in Delmont, South Dakota first, and Crow Creek Reservation and Lower Brule Reservation. And finally at Pine Ridge Reservation after the 2015 severe summer storms there. Can you tell us a little bit about that work? I know you're there today. Tell us a bit about what you're doing there. And then also kind of about the unique declaration that was made there and about FEMA's housing mission and what your role has been on Pine Ridge.
Sure. We are working on Pine Ridge, and it's in response to the May storms and the June storms. The FEMA declaration was only for the May storms, And so when FEMA came in and started doing work, they will provide services for those people impacted from the middle of May to the end of May. I think it was May 15th to May 31st. And those were the people that they were able to provide the housing assistance to, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But then all the people that were impacted in the June storms, the Father Day weekend storms, they were not included in that declaration. And so what ended up happening is about 1,904 people that applied for FEMA were denied because they weren't able to, they didn't meet that timeline or the time spot that they needed to in order to get the services. Didn't mean they didn't have the damage or the needs, they just weren't during the declaration period. And so one of the things that we did early on is start working with FEMA and the tribe to identify what FEMA was going to be doing with those that did qualify and what type of mission they were going to have here. And their mission was a little bit unique compared to what they've done in other areas. They really saw this as a housing mission, and the tribe did a special request to FEMA that dollars didn't go directly into the hands of homeowners, but rather there be a program set up where homes were replaced with appropriate housing or repaired so that they were safe, sanitary, and secure. Because many of the homes on the reservation, if you were to do just the repair work for what happened during the disaster, there would be secondary issues out there that would create further issues, and that the repairs wouldn't last long, or they wouldn't take care of what the overall need is, or our overall goal of making places safe, sanitary, and secure. So FEMA decided to do those three things. One, they did a mobile housing unit replacement. The second was repair and rebuild. And then the third was, if the family was totally against either of the first two and they just wanted the cash in their hands, there was a payout option. But if they went with a rebuild and repair, they might get $34,000 worth of repair work done. If they went with a cash option, they might have got $3,000. So it was a very specific target to address those needs. And then our role in that has been that we've worked with FEMA and the tribe to identify the remaining people that weren't included in there that might have been denied by FEMA to address those needs. And then we've also assisted in bringing in some volunteers to help FEMA with the families that are moving in and out of the mobile units and connecting them with other partners that maybe could assist them in that process as well.
Yeah, you and I also managed to pull off a couple of partnership meetings on Pine Ridge. We did a small grant through a group called Remember, CDP did. We'll talk about the larger grant for them later. But can you also tell us a little bit about those partnership meetings and the impact that had on the work going on the reservation and actually how we brought people together there?
Yeah, at the partnership summits were a really unique idea for us to hold. And one of the responses we got from the tribe was that we were really making history. This is the first time South Dakota VOAD has been real responsive on the reservation as far as they can remember. We've had individual partners that have come in and worked, but as a group we haven't come in and really shown the resources that we can bring into the community by pulling in various partners. And so in order to be more inclusive on that list, we not only invited the South Dakota VOAD partners, but also National VOAD, and then just many of the people that we've worked with in our disaster careers that have been good partners, maybe funding partners, maybe resources to bring in-kind donations, or people that were just interested in specific needs that might be here on the reservation. And so we had really good attendance. The meetings had 40 plus attendees in person, and then we had several people on the phone as well. And what that allowed us to do was really to share the overall needs of the unmet needs and start building that base of potential partners to come in and help provide some services. And what resulted out of that is disaster case management is now on the ground, and that was provided through a grant through CDP to Remember. We've worked with them. We've been able to establish a long-term recovery meeting out of those meetings and to build that base. We have close relations with the tribe and the emergency manager here and tribal programming. And we also have some of our national partners that are ready to start working with us as soon as the disaster case management is in a process to start bringing in those resources. So it's,
yeah, tell us just really quickly about that grant to remember. You were the one that that connected us to that group, and tell us a little bit about how you got us connected to that group, and then how important that work is to the recovery. You know, what is disaster case management meaning to that community?
One of the things I did when I first came down here in October was start working with the tribe and FEMA to identify what nonprofits were in the area. And from that, I went and met with various nonprofits to see who might be interested in doing disaster case management and recovery work, and who might have the capacity to do that or might be willing to build their capacity to do that. And so there were several different contacts we made, but Remember seemed to be the strongest base because they already had a volunteer program that they worked with. They'd been on the reservation for, I believe, 19 years, strong community base, and already had some systems in place to do some of that kind of construction management, disaster case or general case management work. So in talking with Ted Skansky, who's the director of Remember, we decided to work with Nancy to see if that was an option that Nancy wanted to follow with. And Nancy and Ted and I talked about what the needs were in regards to disaster case management and construction management, just to get the ball rolling here in the community. And I think one of the critical things is because they have such a long history and such a strong relationship, they're able to use that relationship to continue to build trust within the community for the disaster services that they're providing. I think the other thing is we're looking at big picture, not just how to put a Band-Aid on the house, but how do we do disaster case management with other partners to maybe meet some of the other needs that are out there, and have those needs be met more wholly so that things are safe, sanitary, and secure. And at this point, you know, without Remember being involved, we wouldn't be active like we are. We'd be months behind. And part of that is it just takes a long time to come in as an organization and to gain the trust of the people to want to work with you or to trust that you're going to follow through with what you say. And so yeah, those partnerships are just critical to making that happen. Then, of course, we have to follow through with what we say we're going to say as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Lisa. Thanks for all that great information. And people can ask Lisa questions later at the end of our presentation. Thank you, Lisa. I'm moving on next to Deb Hendricks, who is the State Volunteer Coordinator for Missouri. And Deb, your leadership has really helped develop this new and innovative consortium in Missouri called the Bridge to Recovery Project. Can you tell us about that project? How did that conversation get started from your end, and how did CDP's grant impact that project?
I'd be happy to. Bridge to Recovery is, at its essence, an expedited repair program. The Bridge to Recovery came about after our flood that happened end of December and into January, and it simply seeks to make repairs to disaster-impacted homes. And the repairs that they are looking at are high impact, but relatively minimally effort repairs. So let me give you an example. In Southwest Missouri, there was a home that was largely habitable, but the one thing that was preventing the family from living in that home is that there was a pipe from their well into their home that was destroyed by the flood. And so Bridge to Recovery was able to step in and do that, again, relatively minimal repair, but it was high impact for the family because it put them back into their home. They had been staying in a hotel room for several weeks simply because of this one pipe. And so that's what Bridge to Recovery tries to do. It looks at what are the repairs that can be done that allow people to get back into a safe, sanitary, and secure home. It may not make all of the repairs that are needed at a particular home, but it will allow them to be habitable. The conversation started because in talking with other states, we see this as a need across the country. When there are low impact disasters, I mean low attention disasters actually, there's a need to get these services done quickly. Disaster case management can take several months to occur if you get an individual assistance declaration at all. So if we can start making these repairs and get people back into safe, sanitary, and secure homes, that's a success, and it is a need across the country. It was tried with varying levels of success in other states, and we have looked at this as being led by a voluntary agency rather than a government agency. And CDP funded a grant to help us get staff on board to coordinate that project.
Yeah, from our point of view, from CDP's point of view, and certainly from the early recovery's point of view, this has been a really exciting project for us. Of course, because it's a pilot, it's been challenging even to get it started, even with funding, right? But I've recently talked to Dan and some of the other people that are living in Eureka at the moment, working very hard to get the project up and running. I know we've had a lot of partners in this work. Can you talk a little bit about some of the partners that we have on board with this project?
Yes, a couple of the key partners were All Hands organization and, more importantly, AmeriCorps of St. Louis. And AmeriCorps has embraced the data collection side of this. They have embraced the coordination side of this and have actually hired Dan Haft from All Hands on a temporary basis simply to do nothing but coordinate Bridge to Recovery for us. And that's a level of dedication that's critical to making this pilot successful, I think.
Yeah, we're hoping that we can share this work with others, right? And I know you just recently had a meeting with FEMA. I missed it. I was someplace else. I was looking forward to coming, but so FEMA is also very interested in this project, if I understand correctly.
That's true. Again, as I said, similar projects have been tried in other states with varying levels of success. So what they're doing is looking at all of these different models and seeing what's working and what didn't work in those that were less successful. And Missouri model appears to have the markings of having success. We are not by any means complete yet. They will come back for an after-action review after the project is completed, but they're looking at us as potentially a best practice model for the rest of the country.
Yeah, what's really exciting is this is a persistent gap, right? This is a gap that FEMA is indicating happens in pretty much every disaster recovery across the nation. This gap between this response stage and this recovery stage, and this work has been working very hard to fill that gap. The other thing I would just like you to briefly talk about, Deb, is this is an interesting disaster in Missouri because it happened at a weird time. Who thinks of flooding during Christmas season, right? And even though you got an IA declaration, we consider this at CTP a very low attention disaster. I know you've been really struggling developing funds for people to recover. Disaster case management has been slow in getting started. I understand you're in Jefferson County. I don't know why you're there, but I suspect it's further work because Jefferson County was highly impacted. Can you tell us a little bit about what do those whose lives were changed by this very large but rather underattended disaster still need? What is your state still looking for?
Well, as you mentioned, we just within the last week got our disaster case management grant from FEMA, and again, as you said, I just have to echo that gap period between when response is over and when these grant funds came to us, that's kind of an unacceptable situation for us, because we know that there are families that are struggling in that interim period. And so, yes, Bridge to Recovery literally does bridge that gap for us. And as you said, because our flood happened at an unusual time, it was over the Christmas, began right before the Christmas holidays, carried through to New Year's. A lot of the primary donors that are our usual donors had already made their contributions for the end of the year. There were tornadoes and other higher attention disasters that occurred immediately after. And flooding is, in general, a low attention disaster to start with, but the timing of this one really made it difficult. So because we have had very little donation to our voluntary organizations, it's been difficult for those organizations to stand up case management in a way that they generally would. And so the disaster case management grant became more critically important to them. And that has slowed the process. Needs assessments are some of them in some areas just now occurring. And we're several months after the disaster. So what we're finding is they need everything from just a few household items. We had a lot of furnaces, air conditioning units, and household appliances that were impacted because it was flooding, and we are a state that has basements. Most furnaces are in basements, and so we had a lot of furnaces that were impacted. And then I personally did intake on a volunteer basis for a couple whose entire home was washed off the foundation, and they had absolutely nothing. So there's a very broad spectrum of needs that still remain out there.
Well, thank you for that, Deb. And anybody who wants to get a hold of Deb, her contact information is available through us, and you can ask some questions if we have time at the end. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, tell us about St. Vincent de Paul and their work and your work with them. I've known you for a long time. You're a great spokesman for the disaster case management community, and I'm anxious to hear what you have to say today.
Okay, good afternoon. Now, St. Vincent de Paul is active, as Nancy mentioned, in many states across the United States. We've been doing disaster work for a long time, and we do disaster case management. We also provide a program called House in a Box, where we provide new household items to families who have gone through a case management process and have a defined unmet need. During the initial phase of a disaster, we work on casework in the disaster recovery centers and the multi-agency resource centers, and we try to connect families during that gap period where there's not funding may be available. We try to help families with gift cards and other items.
You and I have worked together now in 2 low-attention disasters in the Midwest. The first one was in Sand Springs, Oklahoma, which Linda's going to talk about next. And then the disaster in the flooding in DeWitt, Nebraska, which I know is kind of near and dear to your heart. Tell us about that work. What were you able to do with our grant, and what did it mean to the community's recovery?
Well, I think the CDP funding, I call it a force multiplier. We were able to go into the small community that initially had 236 households identified that had needs. We provided disaster case management to the community, because one of our goals is, as a national organization, is to work and build capacity and resiliency in the communities we serve. So we did training to develop local case managers so that they could help during this disaster and any other disasters that would occur in their community. We provided logistical and technical training to the community. We helped them put together a long-term recovery committee and provided training for that. We identified some national partners like Mennonite Disaster Services and UMCOR United Methodist so that they could come in and help on the construction side. And we also identified a need. One of our case managers noticed that the dirt was eroding from the foundations of the houses so that they weren't able to be, the foundations weren't able to be stable. And we had a dirt day, and we were able to get enough dirt donated to help 20 households rebuild and remain stable. So small things like that in low attention disasters. Also, the emergency manager, the fire chief, and the head of the long-term recovery committee sat in a boat on top of a bridge over one of the waterways that created much of the flooding. And they did that during winter, and they sat there for 24 hours to draw attention and to raise funds to the ongoing needs in that community. I think the other thing that the funding does by bringing in national partners is we provide hope for those communities. Many times the local leaders, the head of the school district, the key business people, the chamber, the mayor, they're all impacted personally. And it's very difficult for them sometimes to put together a strategic plan for recovery. And national partners like St. Vincent de Paul Disaster Services can provide that expertise, because we've seen this in many, many different communities across the nation. And we know how difficult it is during the initial phases. So we can recommend some samples of what we've seen in other small communities, and also give ideas on fundraising, and then let them know that it's not going to be immediate, and everyone wants to rebuild and everyone wants to be immediate, but you have to really do a master plan for that community and determine what's going to be effective for long-term recovery. Some of that may be condemning properties. They may no longer be viable because they're in a floodplain, and it's not going to be safe, sound, and secure to rebuild. And how do elected officials then inform families of that? So those are some of the things that we provide. And also the disaster case management. We had 21 families that wanted to move from that community and would have taken away from the tax base of that community. And through disaster case management, we were able to help them rebuild. And we put together a plan, an individual plan for recovery, a roadmap for their future. We kept them in that community, and we helped the economic base of that community.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. That, DeWitt was, I was there several times before we gave the grant to St. Vincent de Paul, and they were really struggling with even getting organized, really getting their heads wrapped around what was going on there. One of the real successes there was once you got your super staff, she was amazing, got her on board, and she started to actually work on a database, right, and gather all the information. I think the community was really quite shocked at the impact and to the number associated with that. I remember, they were told a couple of weeks after the need started that they would need about $600,000 to meet the needs. And I think your team didn't just help us with the tech things like the database, but you also really provided that kind of overview and that leadership and that encouragement to them to keep on moving forward. And I think that DeWitt and that long-term recovery there in that small town has really been a great success, and I think it's really because of this great partnership. I know that it's not your only experience with low attention disasters. Liz, you're actually, I think, an expert, in my opinion, on vulnerability and recovery challenges. Tell us, you told us a little bit about low attention disasters and some of your work with low attention disasters in general, but specifically, what are you seeing even in West Virginia right now, where you're working? I know very intensely.
I'm going to give you two quick examples. One, West Virginia is very overwhelming. There's 12 declared counties, but because of the geography and the abject poverty throughout the counties, it's going to be at least a 5-year recovery period. We have many families where the central business districts have been destroyed, so there's no more jobs in those communities, and we have to help rebuild the business community to be able to have viable jobs again for the families. We're also seeing food deserts because the local grocery stores are gone, the Dollar General's gone, so that's going to be a very difficult challenge. Yesterday, I was in Big Rock, Tennessee, and this is a small community northwest of Nashville, that was destroyed from a flood. And it's, you know, they have over 40 homes that are totally gone. And again, I met with the emergency manager and the mayor, and we worked on a small plan to try to bring in some national partners to help them with recovery. And we talked about doing a long-term recovery committee and an unmet needs committee. So things that they weren't familiar with, and also how to access resources and foundations. So again, I think in all the low attention disasters, bringing in that technical expertise can be great assistance to those communities.
Thank you, Liz. And anyone with questions about for Liz, please ask them. Put them on in the question and answer portion of your screen. And now we're going to move on to Linda. Linda, you are our only volunteer here in this group. The other three are professionals in the disaster field, but you represent today an absolutely essential community resource, community leadership. I know you're now the co-chair for the Tulsa Community Long-Term Recovery Committee. What should funders understand about committees like yours, and why is their work so important?
Well, first, Nancy, I want to thank you and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy for assisting Tulsa County over this last 2 years in our struggle to respond to tornadoes that have hit our community. I'm almost embarrassed to admit that we were not prepared for a disaster hitting our community. We are great on the response side. We've got the greatest fire trucks and the greatest first responders and police and fire. But on the recovery side, we were absolutely ill prepared. And there's a real important reason why that is. We virtually had not been hit by a disaster in this county since the 80s. And so when a tornado came through Santa Springs, Oklahoma, which is on the west side of our county in March of 2015, we literally had no plan of action to assist those survivors of that disaster. So when I tell you that we were building the recovery bridge as we were running across it, I literally mean that. And thank you to you and so many other people that helped us through building our first long-term recovery committee. One of the things that I want to have funders understand from this conversation is ask your emergency managers in your community, does your community have a long-term recovery committee plan in place, ready to go for when you get hit by a disaster? If not, consider putting some planning money on the table to encourage your community and your leaders to do the planning that they need so that you won't be in the position that we were in 2015. As we began to sort of ebb on that recovery, I shifted to trying to put together a permanent plan that put us in a better position. And as a longtime government employee, my first instinct is always to get the pen and paper out and start writing policy. And so I drafted some brilliant policy statements and tried to make it be an all-hazard planning document, and started reaching out into the community. I first set up appointments with our CEO of our Tulsa Area United Way to have a conversation with them about what their role might be in a disaster response. I had set up an appointment with the CEO of our Tulsa Community Foundation and was scheduled to go meet with them to have the same conversation, and we got hit by 2 more tornadoes in March of 2016. One of the challenges that we faced here locally was our local nonprofit system doesn't have the expertise to do a disaster response. I would say that is probably very common across this country. Most local nonprofits don't have the budget to respond to a disaster. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the staff. So a long-term recovery committee is essential for bringing those resources together to drive the recovery for people who do not have the means by which to recover on their own. It may mean that you have to fund, if you're a donor, you may have to fund some office space. You may have to buy some computers. You may have to hire some additional staff. You may have to bring in experts to train those disaster case managers. No community has disaster case managers sitting around waiting for the next disaster to hit your community. And so you're going to have to likely hire those pay for the salaries of hiring those individuals and get them trained and get them ready to go. The first long-term recovery committee that we put together had about 30 partners. For the 2016 long-term recovery, we have roughly 60 different partners at our table now. And one of the things I really like about the long-term recovery committee structure is you can identify your leaders, you can put together a steering committee, and then you can bring in the assets and the resources and the skill sets that you need as you are recovering from a disaster. As an example, we found on the 2016 event that a lot of the survivors of that tornado have some real serious legal issues. And so we have legal aid on our team. I've also had some contact with some private counsel here who are willing to do pro bono work if we need it. So you can pull in the expertises that you need, use their talents and skills, and then put them back in your partnership bank, if you will, in case you need them again.
You've had just such great success, though, with this partnership development with this last disaster. I mean, I've seen your list of who's on. You've just made a really great video. Do you think that has anything to do with, well, I think you do, but it's kind of a leading question, but do you think that had something to do with what you learned from the 2015 disaster?
Absolutely. I made a personal commitment, and others that joined me on the 2015, that we were not going to stop until we had ourselves in a much better, stronger position to respond to a disaster that might hit this community. One of the most challenging things that I have endeavored is having our local leadership, our elected officials, our city councilors understand disaster response. It has taken a lot of time, effort, energy to educate these leaders in our community. They don't understand the difference of disaster recovery and disaster response. They don't see them any different. And trying to educate them, you have to really build a foundation of their understanding of what it is that we need to get ready to do in our community should we have another disaster. And you and I both know it's just a matter of time before a community gets hit. One of the things that has motivated me also to stay focused on developing what we need in terms of a permanent solution, a permanent strategy, is through my training with FEMA at Emmonsburg, Maryland. It's clear to me that FEMA is pushing disaster responses back toward local communities. Local communities better be ready to respond to whatever your disaster is with the assistance of, hopefully, FEMA. It's on local communities now. And I can't say enough about the concept of having an early recovery fund available for your local long-term recovery committee. Our struggle here in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is not having money. I mean, it's simple as that. And having to put very few dollars together that we've had to be able to respond to the needs of the disaster survivors. For the 2015 event, we still have cases that we have not finalized. I'm hoping tomorrow I will be getting the final report that says all of our cases from that event have been closed. Yeah. For the 2016 event, I'm predicting it may be well into 2018 before we finish all of these cases. And that is so unacceptable in my book, if you will. because these people have been displaced from their homes. They've lost all their possessions, and it just should not be acceptable to Tulsans for them to have to be out of their homes and for 2 years while we struggle to help them recover.
That's a really good point. And one of the questions that I would ask all of our panelists, and anyone can chime in here, is I think one of the greatest challenges, even to our work, is creating this sense of urgency. When you're on the ground working with people and you know they're homeless, or you know that Deb gave a great example of somebody only needed a pipe fix, but they couldn't get that kind of help. What have any of you seen as successful strategies, if there is one, to creating a sense of urgency? And maybe work has to be done before the disaster, I don't know, but maybe it's an educational issue. But how do we create more urgency around this issue and how important it is? And how do we get more funders to understand how urgent it is to get some money on the ground?
This is Lisa. And I think one of the things that we can do to stress urgency is just have a good story that we can tell and get out there to funders. But so often we lack the resources to make that happen. And so I think it's really critical for us to have the resources to be able to have someone that has that in their toolbox to be able to develop, a quick story that can say what those actual needs are and say it in a way that funders understand, and to help them address what those unmet needs are in that community.
I don't know if you go ahead. Tulsa just made a great video. I just wanted to do a shout out for that. Go ahead.
I would agree with what Lisa said. For example, in West Virginia, we have families living in tents. I visited a family recently of 4 that was in a tent with a special needs child, and there's numerous families like that because there's no available housing. And so again, there needs to be some type of funding in the initial phase. Even if there is a declaration, there has to be available housing for families, and that's an urgent need.
Mm-hmm. And this is Deb. I honestly think that response is a lot more sexy, if you will, to use that word, than recovery is. The lights flashing and the sirens running and the people carrying babies out of piles of rubble, that all plays well on the media, and after that they've moved on to the next disaster, and there seems to be an acceptance that 6 months is the generally seen time frame for getting someone from point A to point B. And I think we have to fight back that's, even though that may be what happens regularly, it's not an acceptable timeline.
Yes, the other thing I'd like to, because I obviously completely agree with that, and this idea about vulnerability as well, I'd like to bring into the conversation. So there's kind of this assumption that once people are saved, they're okay, right? And once they're, the sirens have gone home, people have their own resources to recover. But certainly the people on this phone call know that that's not true. Talk a little bit about, if you can, about vulnerable populations and the challenges with meeting their needs. And Liz gave a great example a minute ago about somebody living in a tent with a child. Unfortunately, that's, we see a lot of that. We see who is vulnerable after a disaster. Who's most vulnerable?
Nancy, I'll tackle that one. On the tornado that hit Tulsa, the north side of Tulsa, in March of this year, I'm not sure why tornadoes do this, but they can seem to find the most vulnerable population as they plow through your community. The tornado hit a very old part of our town, and it is predominantly elderly African-American people who are living on very limited means, who have minimal support from their family. They often live there by themselves. Most of them have hearing issues, and ambulatory issues. We found an elderly gentleman who was virtually hostage in his own home because the tornado had blown off of his home the porch and the stairs and the hand railing that he needed to use to get out of his home. And had we not had staff walking up and down streets and knocking on doors, we likely would have never known that he was even living in this home without much assistance from his family. And so there is, it's a unique thing. Disasters do seem to find some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And there are a huge number of elderly widows living in this particular area that got hit. We have, some of them had insurance, but they are struggling making decisions about who to call for help, who's a good contractor. So even people who do have means by which to recover through an insurance policy still need support because they're in and of themselves pretty vulnerable as an elderly person who doesn't have any support from their family or their children, and they've outlived their spouse who often made all those big decisions in their lives, and they feel so vulnerable because they're having to deal with contractors to put new roofs on their homes, which they don't know anything about. And so that's our current experience going on in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with the most vulnerable population that we're serving.
And this is
Lisa?
Deb, I think.
Deb, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No,
I think children are vulnerable so often because they require the supports of the entire community to make them whole and make them feel better again. For instance, in the Joplin tornado in 2011, we lost 7 schools. And children are so dependent on what schools provide to them beyond just the education. It's the after school and before school programs. It's 2 meals a day for some children that they don't get if the support of the school is not there. And so I think that makes them particularly vulnerable as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Children have special needs, unique needs. They also, you bring up the fact that they need routine so much. They need that school system back. I think what, the conversation today has really focused on, recovery, the challenges of recovery, but the real need for more resources for recovery and a better understanding among funders, especially on what the specific needs are after disasters, the long-term needs, the long-term gaps in funding, and this idea that without that kind of funding, people that either were vulnerable before the disaster or have become vulnerable after the disaster, particularly elderly people and children, I think, but certainly also people with mental health disabilities, veterans, and also people who live in vulnerable housing. We've seen a lot of that, certainly on Pine Ridge and certainly in Missouri and Jefferson County, today, where you are today, Deb. A lot of the people who were impacted by this disaster, I know, were living in very vulnerable housing before the disaster. We do have a question here from Lisa. She's asking, are there any funder collaboratives that have formed to address permanent issues of disaster preparedness, response, and recovery? I'll just take that one on quickly. CDP also has some relationship with a wonderful program called PREP. I can't tell you exactly at the moment what PREP stands for unless I had it written down in front of me, but it's a consortium of community foundations in the Midwest are doing a wonderful program about exactly that, about embedding best practices within their community foundations around disaster preparedness, recovery, and certainly also community resiliency. And so certainly, Lisa, if you want more information about that, please email us after this webinar, and we can give you some more information about that. I also wanted to just talk a second about some next steps with, whoops, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. That's what, I shouldn't be in charge.
Nancy,
But we certainly
Nancy, we have
want.
someone that put a chat request in. A question on the
Say that
chat.
what?
There's a question on the chat line.
Oh, okay. Can you speak about your experiences with unmet needs roundtables and with your view of how effective they are in the recovery process of communities? Anyone? Unmet needs
This is
roundtables. Yep.
Yes, I feel that they're very effective because they bring together a number of funders, and also it's a fair and equitable way to vet the families that are applying through the Long-Term Recovery Committee.
Yes, I agree. I think they're essential, right? The distribution of resources and the transparency that's needed for that is very important to continue to get funding and to let funders know that their funds are being used in an intentional way. To be fair to everybody, I hope your time today has helped you think outside the box about early recovery funding. Disasters change lives and recovery takes time. But we can all learn from each other on how to do this work more efficiently and effectively. To those of you who may be planning disaster response funding, CDP has many additional resources and information on our website, and we are happy to engage you in any further discussions. In order to respect everybody's time and to keep this to an hour, unfortunately, this is all the time we have. We've gone 1 minute over. I apologize. I want to give a shout out to Liz and Deb and Lisa and Linda for taking time to share their insights, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We'd also like to extend our thanks to the UPS Foundation for their sponsorship of this webinar. If you have any questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's call, please email us at, I'm trying to get that up on the screen here. That's our contact information. That's my contact information, and we look forward to having you ask us questions and to hopefully be able to have you partner eventually with the early recovery program. Thank you for your time today, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you, guys.